Hey, what's up? It's Soup here, and welcome to my Mythic Painsmith Kyrian Arcane Guide. Let me start by saying I loved progging on this fight. It can be frustrating for sure, but the way Arcane gets to play on this fight is a lot of fun. Given how mechanically intensive this fight is though, I'm going to start by explaining the Mythic version of the fight first, and then get into the Arcane specific guide. Alright, let's get going. There are quite a few changes to how this fight works on Mythic, so I'm going to explain each phase at a time. Starting with phase 1, the chains have an additional mechanic to manage. When the tank hit lands, all 3 people with chains will throw 1 row of spikes in 4 directions as well. This means chains go to the middle and line up diagonally. This also means that the boss and the raid will be in a 5x5 corner for most of the fight. If you get chains, be sure to use a defensive because they absolutely truck, and you're closer to the tank hit, which also trucks. Also with chains, make sure you don't stand on a line between the squares when the tank hit goes out because you will kill yourself because you're technically in 2 hitboxes. Traps are dropped on the edge for all but 1 set of traps in phase 3, which I'll go over later, and we had our tanks manage them. For Mythic, you'll be focusing the ball on the edge for the entire fight. And lastly, you can squeeze extra damage out of phase 1 if your raid waits to push the boss to 70% until he begins to cast the tank hit. If you push him after the tank hit timer ends, but before he begins his cast, you can still get good free up time, just not quite as much as if your raid lets him start casting first. Our best burn got him below 65%. Next, let's look at the intermissions. The Mythic intermission is very different from Heroic, and both intermissions are pretty much similar aside from some variance in the spike gap pattern. There are 3 major changes that you need to be aware of though. First, there are 2 sets of balls that spawn on the right, then left side, and move laterally across the room with a gap between each ball that you need to avoid as you run through the spike gaps. Next, the final embers will spawn 5 adds that must be killed before they finish casting. And finally, it's crucial that everyone in your raid use the interact with mouse over macro and hotkey for the lock gate. This tech is used to ensure that all 5 adds spawn in the same spot to give your raid the best chance of killing them. You take the lock gate across the spikes right after the final spike wave spawns because the gate makes you immune to spike damage, which happens very shortly after the 8th ember pools go off. It's important to note that the lock gate does not make you immune to the ember pool damage, so wait until they've gone off to take the gate. I've included the weak aura for the lock gate timing as well as a guide on how to set up the interact with mouse over tech in the description. I also strongly recommend that you turn on the countdown timer option in the boss mods you use for the embers cast during the intermission. I've included a guide on that in the description as well. On to phase 2. Not too much changes in this phase. The boss will be tanked in the opposite corner, but the tank hit, chains, and traps have the same relative positioning as phase 1. Spikes are the same as Heroic, step over the wave as soon as you can. You can also get extra damage on the boss if you wait for the tank hit to push him to 40% similarly to phase 1. The major thing to note in this phase is just make sure you don't push the second intermission shortly after traps spawn because the intermission spikes will pop them and wipe the raid. And last, phase 3. This phase is very different from the first 2 phases. You're going to lust as soon as the ads spawn, and the positioning for chains, tank hit, and the 3rd set of traps changes. As you can see in this graphic, the chains need to move to the edge of the room opposite the ball wall and maintain the same diagonal formation. The tank gets Blessing of Protection and moves into the corner of the ball wall opposite the raid. The raid needs to move next to the balls while chains move to the edge. And the last change is the 3rd set of traps will need to be dropped in the middle because of the enraged spikes that spawn on the outer edge. Alright, now that I've gone over the fight mechanics, let's get into what this means for Kyrian Arcane. First, Soulbinds. I chose to use Clay on this fight for 3 reasons. My raid didn't need help with the ad damage, slowing DPS in phase 1 made arcane power line up well for boss damage without any cooldown reduction, and based on logs, it seems like the fight time needs to be at least 6 minutes 45 seconds to get the 4th arcane power out, and our first kill was 6 minutes 10 seconds. Helgos is also a perfectly viable option for this fight, especially if you're trying to get arcane power back for the ad damage because arcane power wasn't quite up for the ads with Clea. Next, I want to go over Slipstream versus Shimmer. This is the first fight that I thought I'd for sure be using Shimmer on. However, it turns out Slipstream is pretty great for this fight as well. The main benefit to me for Slipstream is the ease of building 18 barrage stacks and 4 arcane charges during the intermission. This comes down to personal preference though. Moving on to chains. Regardless if you choose Shimmer or Slipstream, I don't believe that mages should ever have right of way with chains on this fight. Having any type of blink on this fight is amazing, and mages should use that to give other classes room to get in position. Blink wide and give your teammates room to file in. Always use either mirror images and or greater invis when you have chains. You can use invis for 1 tank hit each phase. Next, I want to explain how I used alter time to hop the ball wall and not lose any rune uptime during arcane power when the balls spawn close to the raid. This is accomplished by using Presence of Mind after your first hard casted arcane blast, which lets you move to the balls to set alter time while casting instant arcane blasts, and then alter back to the original spot on the other side of the wall to cast barrage with the rune buff and balls included in boss funnel. It's important to note that I think casting barrage too quickly after snapping back with alter might not include the rune buff for barrage. I suggest holding the barrage until you see that you have the rune buff just to be safe. Alright, now let's get into the fight from an arcane perspective. Starting with phase 1, the first arcane power ramp starts halfway through the first tank hit cast. If the balls spawn far away, then you may have to hold the barrage global very shortly to give your tanks the best chance to get the boss in cleave range. Sometimes they don't and the big barrage doesn't cleave. It happens, it's alright. Hold DPS around 73% and start prepping for the next Magi if not already at 18 stacks. I wait to start the next Magi ramp until 3 seconds before the tank hit timer, since we slow DPS and try for extra phase 1 damage. You also want to stand in the middle of the room because the boss will run towards you and you can get the 5th arcane blast off this way. Next, the first intermission. The most important part of both intermissions is remembering to set the gate to focus before the pull. Regardless if you plan to use arcane power on the ads or the boss, you will be building to 18 stacks during the intermission. If you are using arcane power on the boss, you also want to build 4 arcane charges to use on the ads. This can be done by either sending orb through the balls or casting arcane explosion as you run through. Watch the weak aura gate timer closely to avoid going early or late, and if using arcane power on the boss, then cast rune as soon as you move out of the final pools. It's important to remember to wait until the Ember Swirlies spawn to move after taking the gate. On to phase 2. This phase is very similar to phase 1. If using arcane power on the boss, you can jump the ball wall the same way as phase 1 if it spawns next to the raid. Start your ramp when there's 3 seconds left on the spiked balls timer. Moving on to the second intermission. Again, remember to set the gate to focus before the pull. The only major changes from the first intermission are the final gap in the spikes before you take the gate will not be in the middle, and if you use arcane power on the boss, then Lust lets you buff the second barrage during ads. Lust as soon as the ads spawn. And finally, phase 3. The timing and placement for your first arcane power will be dependent on if you get chains. If you do get chains, you can begin your ramp as soon as you get to your spot by the edge. There's just enough time to finish the ramp and blink over the spikes. A fun aspect about blink is it will move you exactly the 5 rows you need to get to your new spot opposite the ball wall. So you can blink as soon as the balls spawn and immediately begin ramping, and blink will just be coming up when it's time to blink back over. If you use shimmer, make sure you'll have both charges for this. If you don't get chains, I suggest using alter time and presence of mind in a similar manner as the first 2 phases, but in a different location. You can see in this clip that I'm able to use alter time in the 6th row to hop the ball wall and get my damage out while still being able to blink over the spikes. This graphic shows you that the balls are 3 rows through when the first tank hit lands in phase 3. The ideal placement to jump the ball wall quickly is to start the ramp in the 5th row and place alter time in the 4th row, but anywhere inside the safe zone will work well. Lastly, because the first pot is delayed in phase 1, it probably won't be up during Lust, so make sure to use it with your last mini burn. Alright, that's going to be it for this guide. Huge thanks to everyone for watching, and I hope my content's helping everyone get more fun out of this build. As always, if you've learned something, please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or join my Discord, or just drop by and catch me live on Twitch during raid Tuesday through Thursday. Remember to be patient with this boss because it does take time and practice. Good luck on Prog, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace!